The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Mike has written a book about his 40-year career at GE. He started 76 to 2016, right?
Yeah.
He went to his high school, no, he went to his college graduation at RPI, which was a Saturday. He started work that Monday. Stayed for 40 years. And he worked at GE for, think of those years, 76 to 2016. It was a time of a lot of changes in technology, in women entering the workforce, in management styles and all that kind of stuff, which I'm just going to talk about. And the book is, I read the book because I interviewed him on a stage. It's a very interesting book. Both his grandparents worked over there too. I hope I'm not ruining anything for your story here.
Okay.
Anyway, the book is called Privilege. And if you see the cover, Privilege, the GE is the GE logo. So here's Michael Davi to talk about working at GE for 40 years during a time of a lot of changes.
Most people ask me why I wrote the book, so I put this slide together that kind of covers that. As Joe mentioned, all four of my grandparents worked at GE at one point in their life, so it's a little tribute to each of them. Go ahead. Of course, my parents, who made lots of sacrifices so I could get an education that they never really had a chance for other circumstances in their life. Basically, I was the first in my family to go to college and get an engineering degree, and I became the first professional in the family to work at GE. Gratitude for my education, which really was the key to everything, including all the people who taught me along the way, many of my coworkers. It was a constant, continuous, lifelong educational experience. It's a historical record from the perspective of a frontline worker in the trenches, and not many people at my level of service in the company actually write books. Usually they come from the upper level executives, but I wanted to write one from my perspective. And lastly, but not least, I wanted to encourage others to consider writing, because I'm sure there are stories out there that are equally as good and probably better than mine. And also to inspire, hopefully, a new generation to consider science and technology careers as well. Go ahead. So I mentioned my grandparents. Let's bring them up here really quick. My two grandfathers came here more than a century ago as young teens, like many immigrants did. I'm a second generation Italian-American. As you can see by those names, they were quite Italian, and Icabucci is a mouthful to pronounce. My grandpa, Michael, that I'm named after, he actually came first in about 1910. Neither one came to Schenectady initially. He went to Rome, New York area where there were relatives, and the other went to New Haven, Connecticut. Eventually they migrated here because they heard about Edison's big works going on at GE, and there were good job opportunities. None of them had formal education, but each of them, like many immigrants of the era, they had a strong work ethic and they learned very, very quickly. They're all from the pretty much central regions, mainly three provinces in Italy. In the Campania region, Caserta, Benevento, and Avellino are the three provinces they're all from. My two grandmothers actually worked in the 40s during the war years, when the men were all called into service and women were needed to bolster the workforce. My grandfather, Michael, who I'm named after, unfortunately contracted pancreatic cancer in about 6 weeks after World War II. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and he passed away, so I never got to know him. Left my grandmother a widow with 6 kids, aged 3 to 15. My dad was the oldest male at 13 years of age. So the family had huge hardships right off the very beginning, which kind of took away a lot of their ability to get education like I had. There's some photos of my grandmother's pins from the 1940s and 50s. Both of them worked both those decades. Her ID pins and her GE ID badge is in the middle. Just threw that up there because I found them recently. Talking about family service, the first 4 names on there are my grandparents. I didn't realize this when I wrote the book, but I've learned it since. Our family has over 2 centuries of service with GE. The 4 grandparents and then 2 sets of aunts and uncles worked there at various points early in their career. And then myself, I was the first professional to work at GE, followed closely by 2 cousins who also studied engineering. And one cousin's husband, Brian Connolly, is still working there. So the meter's still running on our immediate family line of service at GE after 2 centuries worth. I'll just real briefly show you, I did some research on my grandparents and when they came here. This is where I discovered that my grandfather, Michael, when he came in 1910, he actually was accompanied by my great-grandfather. We didn't know that till I found this manifest on the ship on the SS America that they arrived on. So research requires a lot of detective work, and the reason no one found their name earlier in the family, even though they had looked, was you can see all this script printing. They had taken, his last name was not Davi, D-A-V-I. The Army did that when both my grandfathers enlisted in the Army for World War I. That's how they got their citizenship, by the way. The Army changed his name from Ayadavia to, they shortened it to D-A-V-I. And when he arrived here, the Ayadavia, the I looked like a script S or a different letter. And so when I did the search the first time, it didn't find it. But you got to be a bit of a detective and look for other spellings. And eventually I stumbled on this, and then everything lined up. The first names, where they were from, where they went, we correlated it that way. So you do have to be a bit of a detective when you dig into some of these old archives. I found this story in the GE News, which is kind of moving that I didn't know about. But when my mother's parents, maternal grandparents, they went back and forth to Italy a number of times on the boat. In the late 30s, they left their youngest son, for whatever reason, I haven't been able to figure that out, in Italy with his grandparents and aunt and uncle. For maybe a year, they were going to leave him because he was awfully young. They both needed to work when they got back here. And the 2 girls, my mom and my aunt, her younger sister, were older. So they left my uncle there, and unfortunately, World War II started to happen, and Italy was on the opposite side. And my uncle got trapped in Italy because no more travel was allowed and no more communications. So my grandmother was very nervous about and worried for several years of not hearing through the war years. So she put an ad in the GE Works News, which was a weekly newspaper. And she did that out of kind of like almost a message in a bottle. But it turns out they delivered the GE News to GIs overseas. And she was hoping one would see it and one would do, toward the end of the war, as the Americans were gaining a foothold Allies were gaining a foothold in Italy, someone would go look up her son. And lo and behold, a private from Schenectady, of all places, like, I can't make this up, he sees her letter or notice in the GE News, and he goes and on his own looks up my uncle and finds him and sends a note back to my grandmother and lets her know everybody's okay, and they reestablished communications, and within a year of that, they brought him back to the U.S. Anyway, that was a very interesting story I never knew about, but doing all these GE News articles and papers are now digitized at the MySci Museum, Schenectady Museum of Science and Industry, and I was able to search on their names, and that's how I discovered this unusual article. Go ahead. And of course, the one and only time after 40 years with GE, I show up in the GE News as a 15-month-old baby. I guess that kind of made my destiny sealed that I was always going to be a GE guy, but that's the only time I ever made the GE Works News. My 2 grandmothers are noted there. In 1955, they were both still working there along with one of my aunts that I mentioned earlier. Go ahead. All right, so let's get into the book now, and I'll give you a few slides on a couple of chapters. What was so unusual about my career, because that's the subtitle of the book? Well, it turns out from the first day I started work, and we'll tell you about that in a moment, I ended up working with some of the best talent in the company. Not through anything I did particularly unusual, but it just happened that way. Go ahead. I worked for over 30 managers, two vice presidents directly, and several GMs. Only about 6 of those 30 managers actually hired me. GE was a very, very dynamic place, and lots of changes happened for reasons that I didn't have any control over. I had some very unusual first-of-a-kind assignments, and we'll talk about some of those involving seagulls and ships, trains, doing some talks. Ralph may know about some of the regulatory talks Marv Shore and I did. I was a conference speaker and a liaison to the research center in Niskayuna. I made several trips on company jets, and we'll talk a little bit about those, which is pretty unusual these days, including a very interesting captain. I did some exotic travel to 4 continents, including Singapore, Australia, and Japan. Managed one of the largest turbine contracts in GE history, over $5 billion with Duke Energy. And last but not least, my career spanned probably the most technological changes that happened since the Industrial Revolution. It was an era of internet, cell phone, email. None of that existed when I started working in '76, actually as a co-op intern in 1974. All of that came into play while I was working. Go ahead. You can click the next one too. Here's an outline of the chapters in the book. The ones in orange are the ones I'm just going to touch on briefly, with pretty much all photos from here on out. And all these photos, I said, are on my website. If you go there and want to look at all of them, you can. And they're all captioned on the website, so you can. They're all organized by chapter, so they're more meaningful. Foot in the Door is the first chapter, and I talked about how I originally got into GE. But really, it was the U.S. space program that got me interested in science and technology. I watched every single launch from Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and it lit a fire in me that never went out my whole life. I just got very interested in science and technology. And it turns out, during all that time, all those launches, I would listen to my favorite broadcaster on TV, a guy named Walter Cronkite, who many of you probably heard of. So I just thought it was very, very uncanny that of all people to give the commencement speech when I graduated from RPI in May of '76, the guy I had listened to all those years, I couldn't have picked a better commencement speaker than Walter Cronkite. Anyway, my grandmother even came to that because it was her favorite newscaster as well. But education really was the key. I got an education that a few in my family had a chance to, and I made the most of it. So next chapter is like my first day on the job. Actually, 6 months before I started at GE, there was a crash of a DC-10 at Kennedy Airport. And that DC-10 had the new GE CF6 engines, which had just come out. And that, I didn't realize it at the time, but that crash, the November before I started work, was going to impact me on my very first day, not even 2 hours into my career. And the crash was caused by these guys, seagulls ingestion into the engines. Where have we heard bird ingestion into engines causing problems? Well, there was 136 people on that plane, 139, and I'm happy to report all of them survived the crash without any major injuries, actually, but the plane did not. So there was a rumor that came out that had been like the 3rd or 4th in a series of incidents involving the new GE engine. They thought the new GE CF6 engine had frequencies in it that were attracting the birds. So not even 2 hours into my career, someone comes up to me and says, can I support a job the next day to go down to Atlantic City to meet with some of the top experts in the company that are going to do a study, and they need somebody to operate acoustic equipment and gear for a test they plan to do at a wildlife preserve. And this fella, who I didn't meet until years later, Dr. Jerry Hahn, was GE's leading statistician. And he had worked on credibility and working together with other experts to put together a meaningful experiment where we could play jet engine noises to seagulls on a wildlife preserve and get data that would be meaningful. Jerry was later my professor at Union College. When I met him a couple of years after I did this project, I read one of his papers and he had mentioned the project in there, and that's when I told him, hey Jerry, I was the guy that actually executed the experiment you put together. We've been friends ever since. Here's the 3 gulls that were mainly our targets. Mainly it's that great blackback on the top, which they grow quite large and they have a wingspan of about 6 feet. So they can do a lot of damage if they're sucked into a GE jet engine or any jet engine. We worked out of this wildlife preserve. We got special permission in north of Atlantic City, north of Brigantine, New Jersey, which is the next island up the coast from Atlantic City. And that's myself with Dr. Mike Schalter, who was an ornithologist from the University of Maryland, and his fiance at the time. And of course, at night when we were done with our testing, we enjoyed the nice beachfront settings where we were staying. So it was kind of a nice first couple of months. I couldn't believe GE was paying me to do that job, but it was an awfully fun job. Go ahead. Later that year, I got the opportunity to do an even more unusual job, and GE was trying to take that same CF6 engine. They took the big fan off the front, they adapted it to be a propulsion source for Navy ships. And the Navy was very interested in using gas turbines to power their new destroyers, which at the time was the Spruance class. They're now advanced to the Arleigh Burke class. But back in '76, the Spruance class was the new destroyer that the Navy was trying to bring out. And they had a test ship called the Admiral Callahan, which I got recruited to ride on and take sodium measurements on these engines, because the engines were designed to work at 30,000 feet. When they're at sea level, they can ingest a lot of salt air, and that salt air was corroding a lot of the parts. So GE wanted to get a handle on how much sodium was coming into the engines, so they hired a group to do first-of-a-kind measurements, and I was on that ship for probably 6 months, sailing from Bremerhaven, or Bayonne, New Jersey to Bremerhaven, Germany. North Atlantic is not a fun place in the wintertime. As a 23-year-old kid, I didn't really appreciate that till I got out there. It was rough. Anyway, the ship was a ro-ro ship, roll on, roll off. It carried tanks, trucks, jeeps, all kinds of military equipment from the States, new equipment to Germany, and it took the old equipment back, or automobiles for some of the officers as well. Go ahead, click the next slide. That's me. I had a full run of the ship. I was treated like an officer. I really got an eyeful and really got to learn about how ships operate, how they navigate, how they communicate, just everything about running the ship. And when we got to port, I had to go to the engines and actually take a wash sample and collect it to see how much sodium had actually accumulated on the blades. So that's me down there in the engine room in port, where I'm actually taking one of those water wash samples. And of course the crew loved me, and I didn't get much appreciation or much notice from GE for all my months at sea, but the crew gave me this nice first-class engineer plaque. I got along really well with 2 different crews that were on the ship, and really learned an awful lot that I would have never learned anywhere else. Go ahead. I went from that, I graduated from my test world into coming to work in a product department. This fellow named Fred Wilhelm, who's still around today, still have lunch with him on occasion. He hired me into gas turbines, which were really what I wanted to work on, was very similar to jet engines. And of course they had to send me to school some more to learn about gas turbines. So they sent me to Purdue for a week, which had one of the best combustion courses in the country. And this fella, Art Lefevre, Dr. Art Lefevre, is one of the world-renowned experts in gas turbines. He's known around the world, and I was very fortunate to have a class with him for a whole week. Guy is really superb, great speaker, very funny, and even personable enough to take a time to do a photo with me outside his office. We tested all kinds of different combustors, some of which we ended up testing not here in Schenectady, but we tested in our aircraft engine facility because these model combustors were much smaller in diameter than our actual industrial ones. So I commuted to Evendale, Ohio quite a bit to do testing out there. And I led to eventually my first patent for GE, first of what would be 17 patents over my career that I ended up with. And last but not least, I did a super successful test of one of our new combustion systems at Houston Light and Power back in 1981, thinking I was going to get a huge award for that, come back, and I got laid off instead. So I ended up working at Knowles Atomic for 3.5 years. Anyway, before I left that group, I did, working at GE gave me a few extra dollars, and I got to pursue one of my lifelong passions, which was flying. And I actually soloed in one of those Cessna 150s on the Wright brothers' 75th anniversary. Just happened to work out that way. But GE had corporate jets, as you may have heard in the news. And on every Wednesday when I was working there in that era, before Jack Welch took over, under Reggie Jones, who was the CEO, that jet would fly down to our Greenville, South Carolina facility. And if you had business in Greenville, you could call up the general manager and ask if there was a seat available on that jet. And if there was, and no one higher in the company needed to go down, you could ride on that jet. And they would just charge it as if you were buying an air ticket. So I did one day. I called up, and I had to go down for a day, and there was a seat. And lo and behold, I showed up at Schenectady Airport at 6:30 in the morning, and there was a nice big shiny jet sitting on the apron waiting. So I was flying at the time. My solo wings were on the wall, and I went up to the captain and first officer who were filling out the manifest. There's a whole 6 of us going to fly on that jet that day. And I asked if I could come up to the cockpit when we were in flight, because I was a student pilot. And the captain stunned me with his answer. He said, not only can you come up to the cockpit, he said, you're welcome to ride in the cockpit the whole flight. And I was just flabbergasted by this. So I did that and got my own headset. I was on the intercom with them, sitting between the 2 pilots and getting a bird's eye view of just an incredible, education firsthand. But the story gets even better than that, because it turns out that the captain was the chief captain of GE's jet fleet. His name was Captain Jim Farrell, but in World War II, he was Lieutenant Jim Boss Farrell, who flew B-26s from England to Europe during the war. And he was not just any lieutenant. He flew more missions in a B-26 than anybody else. And his plane ended up being one of the most famous planes in World War II. In fact, it's at the Smithsonian. And me learning all that about this pilot, found out about his plane, I decided to go. I was in Washington for other reasons. I had to go visit the Smithsonian, and there's a photo in front of his plane, which was nicknamed Flak Bait. And I took photos there. And his plane, I understand today, only the nose was on display when I visited it back in the 80s. Early 80s. Now they are putting the whole plane together. They have all the rest of the pieces. It's the only last of the B-26s that they can fully put together based on a lot of, that's still one of the more famous planes of World War II. So they are working on putting it together. After that, I left Knowles and went back after I came back to gas turbine, and I was trying to figure out where I had landed because I was in a new role. This fella, Bob Gessner, who's still around, he's 90 today, and still have lunch with him on occasion. He comes to lunch about once a month. And he hired me into a group called Application Engineering, which is basically the technical arm of the sales and marketing for new power plants. And that job opened up a whole new world for me. It sent me, wherever I landed was quite literal. He sends me on my very first job to about the farthest place on the planet he could ever send me, to Singapore. I mean, nothing like breaking a guy in slow, right? Here, go, take off. Anyway, I got some really fun trips, and it really was a career-defining job. I went to Australia a few years later, and that was even a better trip than the Singapore trip. It was wonderful. You do, actually. Two of them are admins, and one of them's a pregnant engineer who had 3 babies while I sat next to her. Nothing to do with me, but all through her cousin or her husband, who was also a GM at GE. But Kathy was a great person, and seemed like every time we turned around, she was ready to go on maternity leave again. Anyway, she was a super person to work with and one of my favorites. Go ahead, Joanna. Speaking of women, though, it was a male-dominated profession by far, but I got to work with 3 really unusual women who kind of broke through the gender gap. Jean Place just passed away last year. She was probably my most favorite of the 3. Quiet, humble. I got to work with her a number of different times. Very, very personable, very kind lady, very intelligent lady, well respected throughout the whole business. One of the few engineering managers that was a woman in General Electric. Betty Lou Bailey was a working level engineer who did a lot of the emissions test work that I worked with her on. And Nancy Fitzroy was the only, to this day, I think she's still the only female president of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. She's still alive today. She's a snowbird. She winters in Florida and flies up here for the summer months. But I got the privilege to work with 3 very unusual women in my career, and I just wanted to mention that. Finally, completing the circuit. I began my career and I ended my career in services engineering roles. And I was very fortunate to know this fella, Steve Hartman, for many years. He became the vice president of services engineering, and I worked on his staff my last 5 years, which made my last 5 years really wonderful. One of his GMs, Julio Mastroni, actually hired me in. And Christian Verhoeven was a vice president from Alstom, the company we bought, who I got to host here in America. They were all based in Switzerland a number of times. But go ahead, Joanna. I worked at the research center. I was Steve's liaison to the research center, where we were doing sponsoring millions of dollars worth of new research, one of which was on robotics and involved unmanned aerial vehicles as well. The latter of which, on the lower right, was my 17th and final patent at GE, where we actually patented a great idea we had for using UAVs. But my story started with astronauts, and it ended with an astronaut, NASA's most famous astronaut, probably most well-known, most experienced. This fella named Story Musgrave came to Proctor's and did a talk. I met him that night, and afterwards, after the talk, we took this photo, and it would start a friendship that goes on to this very day. He's approaching 90 now. I hosted him in Schenectady 3 times and in Greenville, South Carolina once. He gave wonderful talks, standing ovation talks at GE about his experience. He's the only astronaut that flew on each of the shuttles. He's the guy most commonly known as the man who engineered the Hubble telescope fix. He gave the telescope the corrective lenses it needed and other repairs to make it work to bring the wonderful photos we see. So I got to meet a legend, a hero of mine from my earliest days, and we're still friends today. So I can't think of a better way that I could have ended my career. And with that, I think that's it. I'm going to end the talk, and I'll answer any questions anybody's got. I was actually in a flight simulator here. That's a multi-million-dollar 777 flight simulator that I booked a couple hours in Toronto, Canada. And a buddy of mine who's great with camera actually took photos of me actually landing that thing, which I never flew anything that sophisticated, but it's very real, and it's a lot of fun. Yes, sir, you had a question. They're headed for downsizing as far as I can see now. The power business is, although they've got great products, the power demand for new turbines seems to be low. So they're trying to get their costs down, and they've been reducing staff and other costs as much as they can. Yes, ma'am. You got a question back there.
I was so interested about the corporate jets. When did they stop using them if they're not still using them?
I think there was a couple of incidents with the last CEO where they were flying him around in a corporate jet and flying an empty one following them in case the first jet failed. And since then, I think they're using corporate jets, but they're contracting those out. They don't own them anymore. In the years when I worked there, they owned their own fleet. There were like the jet I showed you, that was a small 7-passenger jet. They had a larger 14-passenger jet, which I flew on as well, back and forth to South Carolina one day. It's really nice because you can leave Schenectady and in 2 hours you're on the ground in South Carolina. You can do a whole day's work and get on the plane and fly home. You're home by 7:30 at night. So it's a very convenient way. If you go commercial, you kind of spend 3/4 of the day making connections to get down to Greenville. Yeah, Joe.
You said one of the reasons you wrote the book was to encourage people for science careers, young people.
Right.
What are you hearing? Are young people not going into science, or they need a push, or what?
Some may be a little bit afraid of it. I think they have, some of the people I've talked to think some of the math and science are too hard. You know, if you really love something, you'll find a way to get through it. And, you know, I was lucky. A lot of that came easy to me, although I had to work pretty hard in college to pick it up at that level. But elementary and high school were pretty easy for me, I thought. I've talked to some Siena students earlier this spring, and they have an intro to engineering course, and they asked some interesting questions about what other things do you need to know besides science and math. And I told them study economics and business and how to do presentations like I was doing.
Does your alma mater RPI have more female students than you?
I think they do now. I think that's true in general. I think women in the workforce are more prevalent today than when I worked. And I think it was largely due to those people like those 3 ladies that I showed you earlier that crashed a lot of barriers and, you know, showed that they could do a job, very competent job, and just because they were female is not a reason to exclude them. Yeah, Ralph.
Congratulations on 40 years at GE.
Thank you.
You only got laid off once.
Only once in that 40 years, yeah.
I made it through 20 years.
That's one of my claims to fame.
Just read your book. I'm about to return the library's copy if anyone wants to check it out.
Okay, very good.
I was surprised how slow they were on adapting to the computer age.
Yes.
Lack of foresight, money constraints.
I think it was more money than anything, Ralph, is my personal opinion. You're right about that. GE, you know, Jack Welch bragged about how advanced we were as a technology company. But we were in engineering, and I'll tell you, most of my time in engineering when I was in that applications role, I had a more powerful computer at home, my own personal computer, than my work computer. I mean, Frank Brooks and I, who worked together through many of those years, we tried to make advancements and buy more advanced computers, and we got shut off at every corner. I think it's because GE didn't, when they spent money on buying a computer and an operating system, and you're doing it for thousands of people, they didn't want to do those upgrades as frequent as they probably should have because it was costly. So they took the economics. Joanna, comments on that?
Your overtime was free.
Yes. Yeah, no matter how much we worked, we only got paid 8 hours a day, right?
There was a wide perception that a personal computer was a toy.
Yes, yes. How we doing, Tom? I haven't seen you in a while. Thank you for coming. Yes, ma'am.
My brother just worked there about 20 years ago or so.
Yes.
And he worked there maybe a year. And then he left. He said it was too regimented. And he was doing actually the computer, like you said, the computer and the programming and all that. And there was just so much going on and just so regimented. And he left. Now he's down in Delaware. He's got a better job.
It was a high-pressure place, no doubt about it. It took its toll on my hair, among other things. But yes,
They were behind. He said they seemed to be behind on some of the programming and the different things.
I think they were, and I think a lot of it was driven by cost constraints. They were trying to hold down costs, so if people had to work a little harder on an older computer, slower computer. Let them do that. It's cheaper for us, mainly because they didn't measure that lost time, and they were getting some of that overtime for free. So it didn't show up. That's my personal take on it.
Very frustrating.
It-
He tried, and just like couldn't.
I sensed that, and I shared that, and I experienced some of the same frustration.
Good job.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the people were terrific. I mean, I got to say, the people, 2 of which are here in the room that I worked with, and including Joanna, 3 of which that I worked with, and Donna as well, right? So the people I know are, they're like almost family to me. They're like an extended family. They were the greatest, and every one of them taught me something, and I was always grateful for that.
Both my grandfathers worked on the turbine. I'm not exactly, I think he physically worked on the turbine.
Steam or gas, or not sure? Steam?
Must have been. He missed it a while ago.
Okay. Well, good. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Ralph again.
With 17 patents over your career, has the company changed their rewards for those?
Somebody asked me that just last week. Actually, no, they hadn't. Actually, the rewards have gotten worse. When I first started, and Tom, maybe you'll share, I'm sure you got some patents from GE as well. They used to give you $1,000, and they used to pay the taxes on it, so you got a net $1,000 when your patent was accepted by the company and they went and filed it with the U.S. Patent Office, then you were paid like $1,000. They still give you $1,000, but now they take the taxes out, so you only net about $600 and some odd dollars. But for every one you get that actually gets through the review board, and they actually get a lawyer to write it up, and you put all the work in to support that, you get $1,000 once they file it. That's what, and you get your name listed. All of us that were professionals had to sign our patents to GE owns all those patents, but we get our name on it. So you get prestige. That's it. That's all we get.
What if GE makes millions of dollars from one of those patents?
Well, good for them. Supposedly we're rewarded by buying GE stock and owning it and whatever, but no, that's all we get as worker bees that come up with these ideas that probably are worth millions of dollars some cases.
If you worked there, both
Yes.
my grandfather's great-grandfather retired from GE. I'm just curious if they're passed away now or whatever. I never know about the ass. But they had like GE refrigerator, they had like a lot of stuff GE.
Yes.
Did they get a discount if you worked there, or they just like GE?
They used to give us, back when GE owned they've since sold the appliance business. I think the GE name is still out there. They sold it, but somebody else, I think it's LG, maybe the Korean company bought it. They used to give us, there were rebate forms we could turn in, and based on the model you bought, you could turn that in, and then they would send you a cash rebate against the purchase. But yeah, you didn't get a discount when you bought it, but you got a rebate for some of it. Yeah, but since they sold the appliance business, that's all ended now. So that's over. But I took advantage of it when I did. Yes, sir.
What I hear the news, the stock is really taking a hit.
Yeah, oh, God.
Like half the value.
Yes.
So you had stock like that, right?
I did. I sold most of it. I still have.
Before it went down?
I still have some of it now that I wish I had sold. I wasn't that smart. Certain other people I know, we won't mention any names, kept, a lot of people, a big proportion of people kept most of their savings and security in GE stock. And it's never a good idea to do that. I'm not going to give a course on investing here, but never have all your eggs in one basket.
Weren't they the world's wealthiest company?
They were at one time, yes. But the mistakes made in the last few years that I'm reading about in the recent judgment, if you read in the paper a few weeks ago, was a small article buried that the Department of Justice settled with GE for a $1.5 billion fine that for discrepancies in some of their filings. That really made me quite angry. think that the guys who were the CEO, the chief financial officer, the board of directors, and all those unnamed vice presidents whose job it is to make sure none of that happens, all of those guys took their windfalls and left and walked away, and there seems to be nobody held accountable for that. So I wrote a little article that the Gazette published a couple of weeks ago on Easter Sunday, actually. The Easter Sunday paper, if you go look up that, you'll see a little article I wrote, opinion, telling 60 Minutes and CNN and whoever else has big investigative teams to get on that and see why is there no accountability for these huge destruction of the company that's happened.
Where's the integrity that they talk about?
I hear you. I know. There didn't seem to be any. Somebody wasn't doing their job, and they got paid for not doing their job.
Even when it was going on, they're talking, oh, you have to have integrity. Well, it starts at the top.
Yes, it does. And the leadership failed, in my opinion, at GE. They failed badly, and they're enjoying the lucrative benefits of having worked there, and they didn't do a good job. I hear you. I agree with you. It makes me angry. Makes me sad that they did that to this great company and hurt so many people in doing so along the way. No, I hear you. Any more? Yes, ma'am.
Is there any turnaround for GE? Do you see them?
Boy, that.
Recently, or is that a comeback?
Yeah, I think this new fella that's the CEO now used to be the CEO of Danaher. What's his name, Joanna? Culp. Larry Culp. He's doing a pretty good job with what he's been left with. I mean, it's a real mess. I think it's questionable how much they're going to save the company. It's not going to be the same company it was. It's going to be much smaller. And I'm hoping they're, for my own personal reasons, that I have a pension that I depend on from GE, and it's tremendously underfunded right now. I'm hoping they're going to be able to salvage the company and keep it going and move forward. But
Do you name names in your book, or you agree?
that's a good question. I named everybody in the book. I named a lot of people with permission, including Mark Little, who was a vice president. I worked on his staff for a couple of years. And I met with him recently, and he wrote a nice review of the book because he liked it. I did not like Jack Welch, and I mentioned him in the book, and for reasons that I mentioned. I think he was largely responsible for setting the company on the course that it ended up. And he was the guy who handpicked Jeff Immelt, who really rode the company into the disaster these last few years. But Jack did something. He got a lot of credit. Everybody thought he was the best CEO ever. And he did a lot of great things. He made a lot of money for GE, but he did it in a way, he changed the technology company into a bank. Most of GE's income from the mid-90s on was from their financial and banking piece of it. And he went into that because it was easy to make money back then with interest rates where they were and the investments he made. But we got into this subprime mortgage thing, and that's what some of this penalty was. And the company was essentially bankrupt in 2008. And if it wasn't for Warren Buffett loaned GE, because the banks couldn't loan GE the money they needed to stay, to have cash, he loaned us $10 billion or $12 billion, I forgot the number, at 10% interest. And he rescued GE. That saved GE in 08, or we would have been in trouble, might have been totally gone in 08, believe it or not. But it allowed GE to get on. They've paid Warren Buffett back, but the company's made some other huge miscues since.
But in hindsight, I would think Jack Welch over a milk any day.
Well, I don't know. I've got mixed feelings about that. Maybe he's a little more technically astute. Welch was probably more intelligent.
Welch had enough gumption to go head to head with people. Immelt was too sneaky. He'd grab the money as he's slapping your back.
Okay.
I don't want that kind of person running the business.
Okay. I didn't know either man personally, so I can't comment. I can only see what I see in the news and form my opinion from that. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that we'll ever see, I thought this a few times over, maybe just the past 10 years or so, because GE's up and down, whatever. Do you think ever we'll see they that iconic sign in that building won't be GE anymore?
Boy, I hope not. I dread that day if that ever happens. I hope not.
GE, and I remember it as a.
Oh yeah, it's been there for like almost 100 years, right? I worked in that building too, right? I don't know. I hope it doesn't come to that. It's very, very sad what's taken place.
Another thing I am talking about, I could have asked my grandparents, but I didn't think I was too young then or whatever, but GE, where did they come up with that name, or where did they actually come from? Like a smaller business, General Electric?
Yeah, when Edison was here, he bought a couple of other companies and combined it with his company, and they called it Edison General Electric, and then they dropped the Edison, and then it became, but it was like Houston Electric, and I forgot the other names. I could go back and look it up. Several companies formed together.
There was a great program on PBS a couple of years ago. I don't know if you did it on demand that talked about the birth of the company. And J.P. Morgan was involved.
I've heard so many histories.
Yes.
That building's like an icon to me.
Sure it is. It means a lot to the Schenectady and all the immigrant workers who came and worked and supported that company in the early years, like my grandparents did, and some of your relatives probably did too. A lot of people put a lot of sweat and equity into that place. And,
You should drive by there and see that. It's like,
oh yes.
You walk in the door and that building.
Well, I still go on the campus. I still belong. They let retirees belong to the fitness center, so I still go on the campus 1 or 2 days a week, and
oh, I heard about
I'll see some other retirees there, and occasionally I walk into very few people still working there that I know, but I'll get some insight on what's going on. I certainly don't envy them. It's not much fun these days working down there.
it.
Well, thank you all for listening. Appreciate you coming. Thanks.